want to talk to you for a bit about Mormonism. We talked about Jehovah's Witnesses, we talked about Roman Catholics, Roman Catholicism, and then we're going to talk about Mormonism. So these are three cults that you'll run into constantly. And Mormonism is a very strange cult. It appears to be normal, but it's very strange. When they had commercials on TV a while ago, and great commercials. It showed a family having a stressful time, and there'd be a big fight happening, and then the commercial was about, we can help you get peace in your home. And then they said, if you call in right now, we'll give you a free copy of the Bible, the Holy Bible. And I thought, you sneakers. I mean, that's crazy, because they don't even read the Bible. But they did that because people accept the Bible. It's like, oh, look, they're like Christians. Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons both call themselves Christians. So they've taken our term. I try not to use the word Christian a lot. I've been using it because it's in my notes, but at the fellowship where I teach, we use the word follower of Jesus, because the word Christian has so much negative connotation to it, and people assume they know what we're talking about. So we're doing Mormonism. Mormonism was started by Joseph Smith back in the 1800s. Joseph Smith lived in New York. The whole story of Joseph Smith and Mormonism does take place in New York. Joseph Smith never got to leave New York with the Mormons. So what happened, it's interesting when you read the testimony of Joseph Smith that comes to your door now. They hand you a testimony of Joseph Smith. It's different than the original testimony of Joseph Smith. When you look up the original, Joseph Smith had an encounter with God, and God told him that you need to. And Joseph Smith's from the church too, right? He's been in church all his life. His family were in church. And he just got bored with it and decided to make himself a cult. So Joseph Smith has an encounter with God, so he says, and God says you need to write a Bible. And so God tells him that there's some tablets that are hidden in Mount Moriah, and that's in New York. And he can go there and he can dig up these tablets, the gold tablets, and then he'll have to interpret this ancient Egyptian language that apparently doesn't exist. So Joseph Smith, very colorful guy. Anyway, him and he had a brother, Hiram Joseph, and the two of them went to work on this. And as soon as they introduced the new religion, the new cult, into the neighborhood in New York, remember it's back in the 1800s when people all knew bits and portions of the Bible, and as soon as he introduced it, the town went crazy. One of the newspaper reporters, newspapers in town, wrote an editorial on Joseph Smith, and they talked about his past. He was a gold digger, and he used some seeing eyeglass kind of stone thing to try and find gold. So he was into a little bit of cultism and occultism. And Joseph Smith, they wrote about his life. They wrote about his family, how his family said that he was such a liar. He would lie about everything. And then Joseph and his brother Hiram went and blew up the newspaper press where that story was written. And so they were captured. They were taken into jail. While they waited in jail, the people of the town had a little uprising. Excuse me. And during that uprising, bullets were flying, and Joseph Smith was killed in jail as a prisoner. If you ask a Mormon at your door what happened to Joseph Smith, they'll say he died a martyr, but he didn't. The newspapers will tell you he died a prisoner. He was in trouble. Joseph, in an interview with Historical Magazine, May 1870, stated that the prophet had been a peak stone enthusiast. This peak stone is this thing he'd look through to find gold. And he was a treasure-digging buff in his youth, and he told fortunes, and he located objects by means of these peak stones. So this is an article that he himself spoke in an interview. The proceeds of the court trial dated March 20th, 1826 in New York versus Joseph Smith revealed that Joseph Smith had certain stone which he had occasionally looked at to determine where hidden treasures in the bowels of the earth were. And he had looked for Mr. Stoll several times. Therefore, the court found Joseph Smith guilty of money digging 6 years after God met with Joseph Smith and 3 years after Moroni met with Joseph Smith. So when we talk about Moroni, Joseph Smith had a visitation from God, his testimony says. The New Testimony that you receive at the door says Joseph Smith had a visitation from Moroni, an angel named Moroni, which is interesting because Moroni in Greek means destroyer, destroyer, and in Hebrew means deceiver. Kind of an interesting name that he would pick. Lucy Smith, who's Joseph's mother, authored a book entitled Biography Sketches of Joseph Smith and His Progenitors for Many Generations. Brigham Young, the prophet of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, Brigham Young was the second president or prophet of the Mormons after Joseph Smith died. He spoke out against the book, saying it contained many errors, and he tried to have publishing stopped. So Brigham Young spoke out against the errors in this book. He wanted to have the publishing stopped. This is written in the Millennial Star, volume 17, pages 297 and 298. Personal letter dated January 31st, 1855. The book spoke of Joseph Smith's background, his religious habits, and his family life. Brigham Young wanted it stopped because it shed a very poor light upon Mormonism. Pomeroy Tucker wrote The Origin, Rise, and Progression of Mormonism in 1867. It was a collection of duly sworn statements by neighbors of the Smith family and by acquaintances of Joseph Smith. According to the unanimous consensus, Joseph Smith was known for his habits of exaggeration and untruthfulness. It's no wonder that Mormonism had to move out of Joseph Smith's hometown, for the unpopularity of Joseph Smith and his revelations were never accepted among those who knew him best. His new religion was considered a sham and a hoax. Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram were killed by angry townspeople June 27, 1844, in the town of Carthage, Illinois. They were killed while they were in jail. Mormons believe that they were martyrs rather than criminals. I know I mentioned that to you. I just found the date. In 1842, John C. Bennett exposed the practice of polygamy. In 1842. So if Hiram and Joseph were killed in 1844, 2 years before that, John Bennett exposed the practice of polygamy. Joseph Smith had never personally practiced polygamy. That's an interesting problem. When the prophet found out about this criticism, he destroyed the newspaper responsible. This is how he got shot. Another edit. Okay, another edit. Okay. Pomeroy Tucker wrote The Origin, the Rise, and the Progression of Mormonism. It was written in New York, 1867. It was a collection of duly sworn statements by neighbors of the Smith family and by the acquaintances of Joseph Smith. According to the unanimous consensus, Joseph Smith was known for his habits of exaggeration and untruthful statements. It's no wonder that Mormonism had to move out of Joseph Smith's hometown for unpopularity. Joseph Smith, his best friends and his neighbors didn't even believe him. They wouldn't even accept his religion. They knew it was a sham and a hoax. Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram were killed by angry townspeople in June 27, 1844. And the reason they were killed was because they blew up this printing press. They blew up the printing press in Nauvoo Expositor. The Nauvoo Expositor is the name of the paper. The prophet and his brother Hiram were placed in jail in Carthage, and on June 27, 1844, an angry mob killed them. In 1842, John C. Bennett exposed the practice of polygamy. That's what he wrote about in the paper, and that's why they blew up the printing press. You may think that it's unfair to list a one-sided argument against Joseph Smith, but the truth is it's amazing. There exists no contemporary pro-Mormon statements for reliable and informed sources who knew the Smith family and Joseph Smith intimately. Nobody else wrote for Joseph Smith. All the existing materials from this era were written against Joseph Smith. Nobody wanted his religion because they knew what kind of character he was. The only people that challenge the above information are the Mormon historians. And of course, because they'd be out of a job. A good example of Joseph Smith's untruthfulness is the documented membership of Joseph Smith to the local Methodist Church in 1828. That is, that Joseph Smith joined the Methodist Church some 8 years after Joseph Smith claims that God told him not to join any church, but to begin his own. So 8 years after God told Joseph Smith not to join any churches, he joined the Methodist Church. He's a liar. In the Book of Mormon, it's fascinating. When a Mormon comes to my door, the first thing, it's two of them. The first thing that I ask them, can you please prove to me that your Book of Mormon is true? You got to understand that the Bible that we have, the Holy Bible, they call that the First Testament of Jesus Christ. The Bible that they have now, the Book of Mormon, they call it the Second Testament of Jesus Christ. The interesting thing is that if you have one testament of Jesus Christ and you have another one that totally contradicts the first one, what kind of Jesus Christ do you have? It's terrible. But you ask a Mormon about the Bible, they know nothing about it because they've never read it. They only read the Book of Mormon. So they wouldn't have a problem with it contradicting. They don't know. So I ask a Mormon at the door, I say, could you please give me proofs for the Book of Mormon? I want to know that your Bible is true. They'll tell you right to your face there is no proof whatsoever. There's no evidence whatsoever that the Book of Mormon is true. That's interesting. So Mormonism is totally based on blind faith. The Book of Mormon talks about two civilizations that existed in the Central Americas. They talk about Jesus Christ walking in the Central Americas. They like to claim the Aztec pyramids as the origins for their people, the Nephi. If you look at the Book of Mormon, chapter 1, verse 7, Jerome 1:8, 2 Nephi 5:15, Ether 9:17-19, and so on, it talks about these two civilizations. But there's no archaeological evidence whatsoever that these people ever lived in the Central North Americas. Not only do archaeologists refute the claims of the Book of Mormon, but they also have considered considerable evidence to show the impossibilities of the accounts given in the Book of Mormon. The Smithsonian Institute in Washington say, there is no correspondence whatever between archaeology and cultures as revealed by scientific investigation. These letters recorded in the Book of Mormon examined by Arthur Budwarsen, 1959. There's no correlation whatsoever. Anthropologists tell us that genetically the American Indian, the Lamanites, are in no way related to the race of the Nephi. That's Semitic, Mediterranean, Caucasoid type. So the people that they're claiming lived there, the people that they're claiming came from these, descended from the Nephi, it's totally impossible. Let's look at other errors in the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith said the Book of Mormon contained the fullness of the gospel, and yet the book completely ignores and contradicts some of the biggest church doctrines of today. For example, the nature of God, the virgin birth, the Trinity, polygamy, hell, priesthood, secret organizations, the nature of heaven, salvation, temples, baptisms, and so on. The Book of Mormon absolutely contradicts the Bible, the Word of God. The people of the Book of Mormon were supposedly devout Jews, observing the laws of Moses. But in the Book of Mormon, there's almost no trace of their observance of Mosaic law, or even an accurate knowledge of it. There's not a mention of it. Why did Jews... Oh, that was just a personal note, sorry. Joseph Smith had a view of monotheism fully supported by the Book of Mormon and the early account of the first vision. but has since evolved into polytheistic view as supported by the successive Mormon scripture, the 1938 version of the first vision, and Mormonism today. What we got to understand about Mormonism, because it's a cult, it's constantly changing. And the one thing they did smart, in the Book of Mormon, I have like a really old one. It's turning brown and falling apart. I meant to bring it today, I forgot. But it has no date in it. And then I have a brand new one, and it has no date in it. So you can't say, well, in the old one it said this, and the new, because there's no dates on them. But still, they existed. And so I have an old one and I have a new one, and you compare the scriptures, they've changed. They've changed incredibly. And it's wild to see. A quick look at the first vision. This is the vision of Joseph Smith. The story of the first vision was recorded 18 years after Jesus Christ visited Joseph Smith. Or was it 15 years? Mormon church historians can't agree. They don't even agree. Their own historians don't agree on the date. The first vision story is very different to the early ones, especially the one authored by Joseph Smith himself. It's in handwriting. Joseph Smith wrote it down in handwriting in 1832. His vision had him seeing disembodied spirits, angels, hearing a message quite different from that one that's covered in their resource book called The Pearl of Great Wisdom, or Great Price. You'd think that the most important event in their church would be the same in today's writings as it was in his version. Anyway, we talked about his vision, but today's version of the Book of Mormon has more than 3,900 changes from that of the 1830 edition. And that the funny thing is that Mormons call this the most correct book on earth. It's the most correct book on earth, and yet it has over 3,900 major changes. A couple of examples. Mosiah, chapter 21, verse 28. King Mosiah, the original edition. The original edition says King Benjamin. A totally different name. This cannot be a typo. These two names aren't even close. Either God made a mistake when he inspired the record, or Joseph Smith made a mistake when he translated. But the problem with that is that Joseph Smith said he's an infallible prophet. He doesn't make mistakes. 1 Nephi 19, 16 to 20. Chapter 19, verse 16 to chapter 20, verse 1. There's more than 50 changes in this section alone from the original to the present version. Aloma, chapter 28, verses 14 to 29, more than 30 changes. In 1 Nephi, chapter 11, verse 21, in the original, on page 25, he is called the Eternal Father. He's called the Eternal Father. In the new version, he is called the Son of the Eternal Father. That's two totally different people. Isn't that interesting? 1 Nephi, chapter 11, verse 18 says, "Behold, the Mother of God." And now the new version says, "the Mother of the Son of God." Before he was the Mother of God, now she's just the Mother of the Son of God. How about plagiarism? Let's look at plagiarism. Remember, Joseph Smith grew up in the church in the 1800s. He had his King Jimmy. He was doing the King James thing. And there's at least 25,000 words from the King James Version that Joseph Smith stole and put into his Book of Mormon. We are told that the Book of Mormon is a revelation from God. The King James Version was written in 1611 first, right, and then 1710 later. It was written first, and yet somehow a lot of it appears in the Book of Mormon in perfect King James English. It was plagiarized right from one book right into the other book. It's interesting to note that even some of the errors in the 1710 version of the King James Version show up in the Book of Mormon. Even the mistakes that were made in that translation of the Bible, show up in the Book of Mormon because he's translating word for word. 1 John 5:7, there was a mistake there. And you see it in 3 Nephi, chapter 11, verse 27 and 36. Mark 16:16 shows up in 3 Nephi, chapter 11, verse 33 to 34. How do you steal mistakes and put them in your book? Neither of these verses appear in the original or the early manuscripts of the Bible, and yet Joseph Smith got the same misinformation from God. When we look at the Book of Mormon, in the front, you don't have a Book of Mormon, do you? Oh, right in the front of a Book of Mormon. Make sure you get one. When the Mormons come to your door, they love to give you a Book of Mormon. Make sure you have one. It's very interesting. It's fascinating. But in the cover, it says that this is a true book of Mormon, and it's certified by 8 witnesses. Each of these witnesses, it's funny because it's like Joseph Smith, Hiram Smith, Jimmy Smith, Billy Smith, and then it has another name, Latimer, Joseph Latimer, Billy Latimer. It's like 2 families are the witnesses that these are the words that were taken off of the golden tablets. There's 2 families. If you're going to do this, if you're going to start your own cult, for goodness sakes, please take a whole bunch of different names. Don't use 2 families. It looks like a conspiracy. It's interesting. No disinterested party was ever allowed to examine the golden tablets. And apparently at some point in time, the angel came back and took the tablets back. You ask a Mormon, like, where are these golden tablets that Joseph Smith took all these scriptures from? And the Mormons will say, God took the tablets back when Joseph Smith was done. And you say, well, why would he do that? Why wouldn't he let Joseph keep them? And they say, well, they were gold. Somebody would have tried to steal them. That's incredible. Their God can't even protect golden tablets. So there's no proof of this at all. Oh, here, I wrote down the names here. Interesting, most of the witnesses later abandoned Smith and left the movement. All 3 of these witnesses, Cowdery, Whitmer, and Harris, all apostatized from Mormonism. So you got those 3 families, and you got the Smith, which when they left Smith, he called them liars. Smith calls the only people that saw the tablet liars. The only witnesses to these golden tablets, after a little bit of time, they left the cult, and Smith says, don't listen to them, they're all a bunch of liars. And these are the people that are giving their claim that they saw the golden tablets. That's a poor move. A commentary on Joseph Smith and Mormonism used by the Mormons is called The Pearl of Great Price. In this book, Smith says that he sent some of his translation of the Egyptian plates with Mr. Martin Harris, one of the witnesses, to the city of New York to a literary professor named Charles Anthon. The professor said the translation was correct and in fact one of the best he had ever seen. Professor Charles Anthon of Columbia University wrote to E.D. Howe and stated that he never said such a thing. E.D. Howe has never been refuted, and because of this, he is feared by and hated by the Mormon historians. It's also interesting to note that in the 3 witness account, Martin Harris says, we'll never know. Sorry, that page is gone. I haven't taught this course in a long time, and just trying to catch up. So what do Mormons believe? This is bizarre. You'll love this. Mormons believe they're polytheistic, for one thing. They believe there's more than one God. They believe Christians are monotheistic. We believe in one God. They believe in many, polytheistic. The Mormon Trinity is not one God in 3 persons, but 3 separate gods, each of whom has his dealing with our planet. So Christians believe in one God, 3 persons, but one God. God the Father is revealed to us through the prophet Brigham Young. This is what they believe. And he is revealed as the Adam of the Garden of Eve. Their God is the Adam of the garden near Eden. Isn't that something? So if their God is Adam, then their God was created by someone else. However, a later prophet, Joseph Fielding Smith, says that Elohim is the first God of the Trinity. Our father Adam is a different God. He is actually Michael the archangel. So the story gets all mixed up, depending on who the prophet is. Apparently, God was once a man like us, but he progressed and became God. We too are eternally existing spirit beings called intelligences, and we can also progress into gods. The Mormon God is very small, a lot like us, but big enough to be an authority figure. This is one reason why so many like the idea of the Mormon God. He is not too far beyond their understanding. The Mormon Jesus is a completely separate God from the Father. The Father is called Elohim, but Jesus is called Jehovah. Even though he is not eternally God, as that name was intended to mean. Jesus is the spirit brother of Lucifer. Jesus is the spirit brother of Lucifer. He was not conceived by the Holy Spirit, but is a product of a sexual union between God and Mary. After all, God was a man just like us, so why not? That's the way the Mormons believe. The Mormons believe in two kinds of salvation. There's general salvation, that's salvation for everybody. It's equivalent to the resurrection. This salvation is for those who died in ignorance of the restored gospel, which is Mormonism. So if you die and you don't know Mormonism, you're not a follower of Mormonism, that's okay because you died in ignorance. So you still get to go to heaven. The second kind of salvation is personal and is only for those who fulfill the ordinances of the Mormon Church. There are 8 main requirements for exaltation. They call it exaltation. The first ordinance is faith. The second is repentance. The third is baptism. You have to be baptized. The laying on of hands. Church membership. Keeping the commandments. Accepting Joseph Smith and his successors as God's mouthpiece. So accepting Joseph Smith and everyone else as prophets. You have to do temple works. The salvation plan of God has no place for works. But this is all works. That's what they're basing it on. The Mormons believe that heavens have 3 levels. The first level is called the telestial glory. And this is where the unbelievers go. So you got 3 levels. Unbelievers go to the first level. The second level is for those who died in ignorance. They didn't say Mormonism was wrong. They just died, didn't know better. The third heaven is for those who are Mormons. Where do they get 3 heavens from? Paul writes in Corinthians and says, if I knew a man who was caught up into the third heaven. And this, anybody who understands books of antiquity know that there are 3 heavens. One is the air we breathe, one is the heavens where the stars are, and the third one is the heaven where God is thought to be dwelling. So 3 heavens, all books of antiquity write about 3 heavens, but the Mormons have taken that to mean there's 3 literal heavens. The Mormon believes in baptism of the unsaved dead. So Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he says, should we baptize our dead? It was a rhetorical question. The people of the time were doing that in these cults. And he said, should we baptize our dead? Obviously the answer is of course not. But the Mormons take that and they say we should baptize our dead. So what they do is they baptize by proxy. So if my dad died and he died in ignorance, he didn't know the Mormon way, then I could go and get baptized for him so that he could enter into that second heaven. In 14 epistles, letters of the New Testament, which teaches us that Christianity is, what Christianity is, the words faith and believe are found 278 times. Faith and believe in relation to salvation. Not once is baptism mentioned as associated with salvation. So it's important that we never get hung up on baptism being part of. We know that the guy on the cross next to Jesus wasn't baptized and he was with Christ in paradise that day. The Mormons believe that marriage is eternal. Not only are Mormons married for eternity, but if a family member dies and is unsaved, the surviving family will have a wedding for the dead so that they can have sex and family in heaven. You want to do it right. You don't want to do it outside of marriage. This is not a teaching of the Bible, that's for sure. The Bible teaches there's no marriage in heaven. That's why it's called paradise. Not really. Sorry. Marriage is wonderful, great institution of God, but it does come to an end. Until death shall separate us. The Mormons believe that they should have the right to more than one wife. The Book of Mormon from 1830 teaches on page 135, verse 5, that a man should have but one wife. So the original version, the original text of the Book of Mormon says one wife for one husband. And then later on July 12th, 1843, God told Joseph Smith that it was desirable to have more than one wife as meaning of giving birth to more saints for the Mormon Church. Under government pressure, the presidents of Mormons, Wilford Woodruff, received a revelation from God saying that polygamy was only to be enjoyed in heaven. So Joseph Smith receives a message from God saying that a Mormon should have more than one wife. And then it wasn't too much later, Woodruff gets a call from the government, and they say, you're breaking the law, and he all of a sudden has a vision from God saying that polygamy is for heaven, not for here. The Mormons believe that the prophets are the number one authority to the church. Our Bible doesn't teach that we have prophets as the number one authority in the church. Doctrine and Covenants, chapter 111, verses 1 to 11, states that Joseph Smith said that God told him that Salem, Massachusetts would turn all of its wealth over to him. This prophecy never came to be. So he said that the whole state would turn their wealth over to him, and that never happened. So what does that make Joseph Smith? A false prophet. The Mormons believe in two priesthoods. Even though we don't have a priesthood, they believe in two. They believe that they have two priesthoods. The first priesthood is the priesthood of Melchizedek, and the second priesthood is that of Aaron. The Bible declares that the Aaronic priesthood was superseded by Christ's atonement and his priesthood. Hebrews chapter 5, verse 1, all the way through to chapter 10. The Old Testament priestly duties were only a shadow of Christ. The priestly duties that the priest did, it's what we call a type in the Old Testament. And in the New Testament, we have the anti-type.